Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons and a specific type of participant. And this participant is called an Exodonk. And an Exodonk is a person who played Dungeons and Dragons. The vast majority, like 99% of all people who have ever played a tabletop role playing game, come in through Dungeons and Dragons. It is extremely rare, like a purple unicorn, for anyone to start playing tabletop role-playing games outside of Dungeons and Dragons as their starting game. It's extremely rare. And so they come in through Dungeons and Dragons, they play Dungeons and Dragons, and then they start playing a game that is very carefully designed from the top to bottom to look like Dungeons and Dragons, but is not Dungeons and Dragons. I'll give you 3 examples of this. Index card RPG. Uh, and actually, so Index Card RPG is actually a good copy of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons. Pathfinder, a bad copy of Dungeons and Dragons. Pathfinder 2, a bad copy of Dungeons and Dragons. And OSE, a bad copy of Dungeons and Dragons. So the reality is, you have these people who come in, play Dungeons and Dragons, stop playing Dungeons and Dragons, and then start playing a copy of Dungeons and Dragons. So let's talk about these copies and why people play them. So basically, people play copies of Dungeons and Dragons because they get frustrated with Dungeons and Dragons, and for a host of reasons. But it's very, very common. It's very much like a teenager, right? Like a teenager will love their parents when they're young, and it's exactly the same arc. People love Dungeons and Dragons when they start, and then they get too cool for school, and they start talking to OSR and indie people, and they're like, oh, and those OSR and indie people are like, Dungeons and Dragons sucks, and they hate Dungeons and Dragons. Why do OSR and indie hate Dungeons and Dragons? They hate it because the game that they want to play with, like, one or say, and the reason why these copies are made is they're called heartbreakers, right? One or two, somebody passionately believes that Dungeons and Dragons is wrong on one or two things, right? So they make their own copy, and it's been done 1,000. This isn't a joke. Dungeons and Dragons. There are people, 1,000 people who are like, I don't like this one thing about D&D. I've remade it, right? And they literally spend a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years remaking Dungeons and Dragons because they don't like the damage on a longbow. If you think I'm wrong about this, like, there's this thing called a heartbreaker. There's a podcast that talks about heartbreaker tabletop role-playing games, and they have like 100 episodes all just talking about what I just said, right? So they really despise Dungeons and Dragons, and so they copy it, right? And then, and why is that not okay, right? Why not just let these people play their copy of Dungeons and Dragons? Everybody plays what they want. Well, the reality is, it's not done honestly most of the time. And you're like, you got proof of that, Scott? And so basically, one of my favorite examples of this is, it was flat out said by a very public Dungeons and Dragons participant, Dale's Kingmill, said flat out, I invited people, said on a podcast, like, just right on YouTube, I invited a bunch of people, told them we were going to play Dungeons and Dragons, and when they got there, they were like, why do these books say Pathfinder on them? And she's like, well, it's the same thing, right? And my issue is, what's happening is, this is the mom who puts peas in the meatloaf, right? And one kid at the table is like, this meatloaf tastes weird. No, it's the same thing. Don't worry about it. And she's crammed, 4 handfuls of peas into it, and it's bad, right? Like, and that's the issue, right? Even if it's better for you, right? Nobody likes it. Nobody likes getting fooled, right? Like, and the reality is, and you're like, well, what about people who say, hey, we're going to play OC, we're going to play Pathfinder, we're going to play Index Card RPG, and are upfront about it? Well, the issue is, even then, like, the game master of any of these games is like, it's cool, it's the same thing. But the people at the table are always like, it's not the same thing, right? Like, my friends watching Stranger Things, and they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. They're not playing Pathfinder. They're not playing OSC. They're not playing, they're not playing Index Card RPG, right? That game has legacy and momentum. Your game doesn't have either. It doesn't have momentum, and it doesn't have a legacy, right? Like, and I'm not going to be delighted when there's no OSC video game coming out, but there is a Dungeons and Dragons video game, and there's a Dungeons and Dragons movie, and there's a Dungeons and Dragons Lego set, and OSC doesn't have any of these things, so it sucks, right? Because it doesn't have legacy or momentum, right? And so these are exodonks, right? Now if they're no longer playing Dungeons and Dragons, why are they participants, right? because they did participate in Dungeons and Dragons, helped to carry its banner, right? And then also they are bringing people to tabletop role playing games, and even if those people come in on OSE, they're gonna get excited and go buy their dice set, and when they go to the FLGS, right there on the shelf, they're not gonna find OSE. They're literally gonna find 50 books for Dungeons and Dragons, and they're gonna say to the shopkeep, my game master runs OSE. What is this thing on the shelf, this Dungeons and Dragons? And they're like, well, that's the real thing that your game master is copying. Exodonks, right? And that person can be like, oh, I'm trapped in an OSE game. How do I get out and get to the real thing? Right? Like, so that's, and that's an exodonk. Oh, and then often those players will escape like these copy games that they get dragged into, right? And then find their way to real Dungeons and Dragons. And then there's an uncomfortable conversation 6 months later when, Sally is like, hey, Sarah, why aren't you at our OSE game? And they're like, because I figured out that you insisted on running a bad copy of Dungeons and Dragons, and now I play with a dungeon master, and we all get excited when Stranger Things comes on and we watch it together, and you can watch your OSE show with no one because there is no show. So, like, I want to be at a party and you're holding, like, a sad gathering of fools, right? Like, so that is an exodonk, right? And they are very real, and they actually do help Dungeons and Dragons move forward in a very weird and disconnected and incongruous way. But they are D&D, and they can return, these OSE people, and they do. Like, they'll be like, oh, OSE is better, but nobody will sit at my table for 5 minutes. So now I run D&D 5e. And if you think I'm wrong about that, you will find them on Twitter. People have said it many, many times. They're like, I like this other game better, but I couldn't drag people to it. And that's why I run Dungeons and Dragons today. So that is an exodonk. They are very real. They very much participate in Dungeons and Dragons, but in a unusual manner. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.